Dr. Bank failed in New York, other banks are failing. We have to decide what to do. So he created a group to study the formation of a central banking system. They went to Europe, Senator Aldrich, so forth. The bottom line was we had the Federal Reserve with two goals: price stability, avoid inflation. And if you're real inflation-oriented, you're hawkish, like the Germans with their central bank, very hawkish. But if you're more concerned about employment, then you're considered a dove. So monetary policy, you're hawk or you're dove. Now, the third goal that we've adopted since the crisis, financial stability. And we see that with all of the discussions, of course, over the whole issue of the stress tests. Now, this is a little complicated, but I just want to go through like Fed 101, how the Fed does its job, what the Fed does, because we read about it all the time. You'll read about it tomorrow and today when the minutes come out from the last FOMC meeting. Monetary policy, as you can see, involves changing the money supply or the short-term Fed funds rate. Now, when we talk about the Fed funds rate, Fed funds, that's between interbank rate, that's short-term rate. It's not the long-term 10-year treasury, it's the short-term rate. Now, when you increase that rate, it's restrictive monetary policy. You're a hawk. Okay, it slows down the economy, but it's good for inflation because it slows down inflation. Now, if you decrease the rate, that's expansionary. You're considered dovish. Okay? So obviously what happened during the crisis, we were very dovish. Now, when the Fed funds rate, we took it down from 5.25% when Bernanke got in down to 0. Can't go any lower than 0, right? So then what we try to do is to lower the long-term rate. So the Fed controls the short-term Fed funds rate, but then there's a long-term 10-year treasury rate. How do we get that lower? Well, we use QE, quantitative easing. The QE 1, 2, and 3, Operation Twist, that put money in the economy by buying treasuries and mortgage securities. And that in fact worked. And it worked so well that the Germans are doing it, the Europeans are doing it, the Japanese are doing it to help their economy after they hit pretty much rock bottom. Now, getting back to politics, the best way to get reelected is to throw a lot of money in the system, expansionary money supply. We see this all the time in what we call the banana republics, you know. They want to get their guy elected, they just keep printing a lot of money. What happens? Inflation, 100% hyperinflation in these Latin economies over the years. So that's the way to get reelected. You control the Fed and you control monetary policy. Obviously, the opposite is true. A restrictive monetary policy can get you out of office. So that's why we say the Fed has got to be independent. But just how independent is the Fed? Well, even though we just had the 100th-year anniversary, you'll see one of the articles in the book here, in your notebook. I believe the Fed has lost a lot of its independence. The most political Fed guy was Arthur Burns under Nixon. He just told him, look, you know what, go out and cut rates so I get reelected. Well, I just can't do it. No, go out and do it. You know, and so he pretty much followed it. He was the most political. The second most political Fed leader, I'll show you in a minute. And the third most, believe it or not, our friend Ben Bernanke, Professor Bernanke. Now, the big decision the Fed has to make is something that we have to dig into when we talk about the AFFF. That's using rules or discretion. Now, regulators like to use discretion in the sense that they have some subjectivity in doing what they want. You know, I want to hire low, but then they also got the rules, like our capital adequacy rules. With the monetary policy, the number one, well, let's say in the last decade, the two smartest economists of all time, were both dead, were Lord Maynard Keynes from the London School of Economics and Milton Friedman, of course, from Chicago. Milton Friedman proposed what we call a constant growth rate rule. He said, just grow the money supply at 2%. You all remember that from macro. And then we don't even need the Fed. Milton Friedman, the smartest economist of all time in our modern time, he said, abolish the Fed. Just get rid of it. Put everybody out of the work. We don't need it. Just have a computer with a mathematical equation to increase money supply M2 at 2%. Well, obviously that didn't go too far, but we have a lot of discretion. Now, Greenspan was very much discretion oriented. Bernanke was more rules. He wanted 2% inflation goal. And you'll see Janet Yellen, she's much more oriented toward what they call discretionary rule. Now, today, we don't use the constant growth rate rule of Milton Friedman, but the most popular monetary policy rule is called the Taylor Rule, from Professor Taylor out at Stanford. Professor Taylor said, we can determine the correct Fed funds rate by having a little formula that looks at inflation and unemployment. Remember, those are the two things that we're most concerned about at the Fed. We're concerned about unemployment and inflation. We want low unemployment and we want low inflation. Those are the two biggest things. Now, this is a rule that you can figure out independently, no political influence, calculated on a real-time basis, and it tells you how good of a job you're doing, whether or not you're really doing what you're supposed to be doing. Now, this is the only complicated chart, because I know you guys have hit a lot of charts lately, a lot of graphs and acronyms and numbers, so I'm not going to try to get you too much of lunch here, but let's look at this. The Fed funds rate is the blue line. That's the actual rate. And the red line is the Taylor rule. That's the red line. That's where it should be, okay? So now, if the blue line, the actual Fed funds rate, is above the red line, that means the Fed's being too tight, too restrictive. The opposite's true if it's below it. That means the Fed's being too loose. Well, how can we prove it? Here's George Sr. Bush. In his memoirs that came out last year, he said, the reason why I lost the re-election in '92 was none other than Alan Greenspan for keeping rates too high for too long. And you can see right here, during that period leading up to the '92 election in November, he kept rates quite high, and he said, that's what killed my chances. So meanwhile, when W goes to Washington, he says, son, when you get to D.C., the most important person you'll meet, the most important person you got to hook up with is this guy called Alan Greenspan at the Fed. And he said, well, Daddy, you know, I wasn't too good in economics. I didn't really do well on this class. I said, don't worry. He says, I'm going to hook you up with a real smart guy, Dick Cheney. Now, Dick Cheney is going to be like a translator. He'll tell you what Greenspan's saying. You just sit there, look smart, look presidential, but he'll explain to you what it all means. He's the man. He's the man. Now, I was obviously a little bit disturbed when I saw some of this. I was doing some regular testimony once, and I saw Greenspan come out of the building. I said, what's he doing here? He should be over in Constitution Avenue and 20th at the Fed. And I asked the guard, he said, oh no, he's here all the time. What do you mean he's here all the time? He's supposed to be independent of Congress. So I decided to look into it, and I started doing FOIA, Federal Freedom of Information Act requests. I became the #1 FOIA requester at the Fed, FDIC, all these offices, to the point where they really got angry, but I kept looking at it, and I said, I want to see his personal calendar of Alan Greenspan. You can ask for anything you want. They could say no. So they gave it to me begrudgingly, and then I looked at also for Clinton's, and I started going back. And I did this research, and I found some very interesting things. First of all, I was the first one to do this research of foiling the requests of all these offices. Now, Wall Street Journal does it every month. And they do it for the FDIC, the Treasury, SEC, everybody. So it's all public. So it's good that that's public. That's what I wanted. But back in the day, it wasn't public. So what I learned, for example, these were all the meetings that Greenspan went to, but I was interested in the White House. So this graph right here shows from 1996 to 2000, during Clinton years, he was visiting the White House exactly 12 times a year, once a month. Well, that's good. You go there, check it out, how you doing, what's going on. Once a month, that's fine. That's independent. You're keeping up to date. Nothing wrong with that. 2001, January, what happens? Bush W comes in, George W. Bush. First of all, Greenspan does what? He flip-flops on the Bush tax credits. Remember, Greenspan at that time was the most respected man in Washington besides the president, second most powerful person in the world, without a doubt. Then, he cut rates by 50 basis points on January 3rd, when we should all be watching the bowl games. This was in between FOMC meetings. He cut rates, 50 basis points, not 25. Gave a big hit to the stock market. But most importantly, he started visiting the White House. And you can see here, in 2001, he visited the White House 37 times instead of 12. 2002, 55 times, 68 times. What's going on? You know, so I published this research, and that was my problem, because it was in the front page of the Washington Post. Remember Alan Abelson, the Barron's magazine, did a big write-up about it, and then Greenspan got very upset. He said, you know what, no more information for Professor Thomas. He just cut me off. So I basically, but now it's all public, because, you know, you get the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal behind you, they'll go and get the information for you if you tell them what to ask for. So this was very disturbing to me to see how political Greenspan became. And of course, we know that when he kept those rates too low for too long, from 2003 to 2004, that was a big reason why we had our crisis, not the only reason. So again, I was going to do a book about this, and just never had time. This was going to be on the cover of the book. I love this picture. You know, pictures worth 1,000 words. This says it all. Well, of course, we had a new guy come in, Bernanke. Now, Bernanke's a professor type. Okay, very smart guy. Y'all remember south of the border, when you're driving up in South North Carolina? Okay, he used to work there. He's from that bill in South Carolina. He used to work there. Okay, worked his way up. Very, very smart guy. I mean, super smart. Very smart, you know. But the thing is, when it came to a crisis period, he misjudged the subprime crisis. He said it's contained, it's no big deal, no problem. Okay, we let that go. But then came August 7th of 2007. Very important meeting. Things were getting real bad in 2007. Real bad. Now we know the crisis peaked in 2008. So just as we all will never forget 9/11, my students will never forget 9/15. Because 9/15 was the date the government, Paulson, Bernanke, got to let Lehman fail. That was the biggest mistake our government ever made in recent times. Huge mistake. I'm a defender of too big to fail. And when somebody is that big, is going to fail, it's going to bring down the economy, and maybe the world economy, you've got to bail them out. Okay? You may not like it, but there's certain things you got to do. Now you say, oh, too big to fail is bad. Well, you live next door to a crack dealer, and you say, oh my God, I wish that guy would die. I wish the house would burn down, or whatever. So one day, the house is on fire, and the wife looks out and sees the guy out there with a hose putting out the fire. What are you doing? I thought you were... No, but if his house burns, our house is going to burn too. You protect yourself by helping somebody else. You save Lehman to save the world. Nobody liked Dick Ford. He was greedy, he was arrogant, he was stupid. But that almost brought us over the edge. That was September 15th. But before all this happened back in August, the writing was on the wall. Things were getting very, very bad in 07, leading up. And it was so bad in August of 07 that I thought for sure Bernanke was going to open the discount window, cut the discount rate. He was going to cut the Fed funds rate, for sure, and he didn't do it. And you can see from this comment here, I made this comment now on August 20th, after the August 7th meeting, and I said, this was a rookie mistake. The Fed underestimated liquidity needs of an investor in the fallout from the recession. This demonstrates the difference between book smart and street smart. Let me tell you, being at work, they got me in a lot of trouble. Because, what's the professor saying? Criticizing another pretty Ivy League professor. How dare you, But you know what? You can be very, very smart, book smart, but not street smart. You can be very book smart and do stupid things and say dumb things, but you're not necessarily going to be street smart. Well, the best example of this is to see what Kramer said at the time. How do I get this going? Yeah, come on over here. I'm just going to play this, give a break, I get a drink here, get some Coke. August 3rd, 07, 4 days before the August 7th meeting. This is Kramer. Now, before you look at this, think of three things. Washington Mutual is going to talk about their Stearns is still around, selling for $100. And Bill Poole is the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. very hawkish. You know, you got the Hawks, you got the Doves, you got the in-between guys like Bernanke, Allen. Bill Poole is very hawkish. You know, don't you dare lower rates. Bear Stearns was selling for over $100. They had some issues. And the CFO went on the market and talked. And you know, sometimes the best thing to do is not to talk at all. Just don't talk to the press. Well, you'll see his take on that. But you see his take on what he thinks of Bernanke. Go ahead. Let's see. Okay, now we're going to take a little break here. Well, while he gets this working, I'm going to continue on. The point was, Bernanke, let me have this. Well, we'll get Billy in here, the AV guy. What happened was, Bernanke did not lower the rates at the time he was supposed to. And the market was in turmoil at the time. So what happened was, I did another FOIA request and found out that the next day on August 8th, Robert Rubin called Bernanke at 5 p.m. and told Bernanke that he needed to lower rates. Bernanke then called in Ranieri, the head of the mortgage, he started mortgage-backed securities. He called in Ray Dalio from Bridgestone Securities, Bridgewater, and he got all of the people involved to basically cut rates. Now this is Kramer talking 4 days before the actual meeting. Yeah.
Boring summer fight, almost, you know, day we haven't had in a long time, just not exciting. Then all of a sudden S&P says, ooh, we're worried about bear. Bear goes down, market goes down. Then all of a sudden things kind of calm down, bear comes out and says, hey, we're okay, guys, we're okay, everything's fine. Bear goes back up to neutral, market's only down 20. Then bear comes out and says, oh, worst spot market 22 years. And that's where we are right now, market's down 120. How do you trade this?
Remember Bear Stearns, you got to adopt a Henry Ford attitude here, which is never explain, never complain, and he didn't do that. Keep your mouth shut during this period. You don't say a thing, because you're going to say something
But
that
then they
people don't like.
complain, and we say, hey, come on, guys,
Keep your mouth shut.
come on here and talk about your exposure.
You speak softly and you wait to that level where you think the shorts have overdone the stock, and then you do what Dick Fold did in 1998. You pick up the phone to guys like me and you say, 32 bid, 1 million, and then you get whacked and you come back and say 31 bid for 2 million. They're not doing that. That inspires more fear. I don't want to create fear. I like Bear Stearns very much, but I think that at this stage, this is not a good call. They shouldn't have done it, and they should have just said, you know what, you're doing well, and don't say another thing. Just don't say it, because it does not inspire confidence to have 10 headlines coming over about what to do. I don't like it.
All right, I hear you. Now, I still, though, you know, when we say...
And the Dow can rally. We see the Dow.
No, I know, but it's just interesting, this bigger...
This is about Bernanke. This is about Bernanke. He has to be on that call. Forget the investors. The investors are going to do it. Bernanke needs to open the discount window. That's how bad things are out there. Bernanke needs to focus on this. Alan Greenspan told everyone to take a teaser rate and then raise the rate 17 times. And Bernanke is being an academic. It is no time to be an academic. It is time to get on the Bear Stearns call. Listen, open the darn Fed window. He has no idea how bad it is out there. He has no idea. He has no idea. I've talked to the heads of almost every single one of these firms in the last 72 hours, and he has no idea what it's like out there. None! And Bill Poole has no idea what it's like out there. My people have been in this game for 25 years, and they are losing their jobs, and these firms are going to go out of business, and he's nuts. They're nuts. They know nothing.
Right.
For a half a million shares of Citigroup when I got hit in 1990. This is a different kind of market, and the Fed is asleep.
Okay, but here's the...
Bill Poole is a sham.
But at the same time, a lot of people are saying this is, yes, there's certain types of mortgages that aren't available. There are all sorts of issues. But Kramer, if he did what you said, which seems to me from the way you just explained it,
Cut the rate. Don't give the discount. Cut the rate. Who has the pressure?
and cuts rates.
Who has the pressure?
You're gonna have, that's gonna cause Armageddon.
No, we have Armageddon. I wouldn't try to cause this. We have Armageddon. In fixed income markets, we have Armageddon.
No, but that's not what
We
they
have Armageddon.
say. They say, you know, when I talk to a couple
If
of
they
banks,
cut
they
the
don't say
rate.
it's Armageddon.
Well,
They say it's repricing. They're very firm about
Oh,
it.
great. Okay, well, let them be calm and then have them call me on the way home like they do every night and tell me, Kramer, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to help us? Are you going to help us? Are you going to stand on the sideline like everybody else and say that it's fine? Will somebody come on TV and tell the truth about how bad it is?
A lot of people say, these same people say, it's not Ben Bernanke and the rate that matters. The bond market
It's
now
wrong. It is the rate. It's entirely
The
the
bond
rate.
market is trading.
No, it's entirely. Look, we'll spend billions in Iraq to build homes. We are going to have thousands of people. We have thousands of people building their homes right now. 14 million people took a mortgage in the last 3 years. 7 million of them took teaser rates or took piggyback rates. They will lose their homes. This is crazy.
Yes.
I'm sorry to be upset about it, but you have to understand what they're saying to me off the record before I come in here every night and every day. And what I hear from these blowhard managers who act like you call someone, for heaven's sake. Go call someone. I worked in fixed income at Goldman Sachs. This is not the time to be complacent.
All right.
I mean, George, sometimes I wish I didn't know anybody so I could just sit here and say, you know what? Just go buy some Washington Mutual and take that yield. Unfortunately, I know too many people and I'm too darn old.
You are 62.
I've just been around for too long. I mean, look, I gotta tell you, he has got to listen to this. He's got to call somebody. Bernanke has to call someone.
He is.
He just has to call.
I can't believe he's just sitting there.
No. They're not going anywhere. And Bill Poole,
I know what
Bill
you
Poole, listen to me. There was a president by the name of Hoover, okay? And no one thinks much of him now. The great engineer.
And a quick reminder.
Well, Herbert Hoover was a great mining engineer. Again, if you look at the rankings of presidents, not considered one of the best presidents. But actually, Bernanke never called someone, like he said. Because my FOIA found out the next day at 5 p.m. that Robert Rubin, former Secretary of Treasury and Clinton, he called Bernanke and set up a breakfast that next morning. And the breakfast was basically, you got to look, and they call it in the hedges and all that, and they finally did move. So again, that was the difference between book smart and street smart. And you can see Helicopter Ben, because he got the name from dropping money on the helicopter, cut the Fed funds rate about a quarter down to 0, where we are now. Expanded the tools. Balance sheet now from 1 trillion to 4 trillion. Bailouts, QE 1, 2, and 3. In fact, Helicopter Ben became so known that we even have a Helicopter Ben tie. which one of my students gave me I'm wearing now. And now, Helicopter Ben is making $250,000 a speech. Working for 2 hedge funds, he could buy his own helicopter. The guy is now making big bucks. But the QE work, well, you can see, clearly helped the stock market. QE brought down 10-year treasury, down now where it's on the 2% range. And finally, Bernanke left. So now, who comes in? There were 2 very able candidates, Janet Yellen and Larry Summers. Both of them had contact with Obama. Obama had to make a decision. No doubt, the #1 guy that Obama wanted was our friend Larry Summers. Without a doubt, he was the most qualified. He was the best person for the job. Look at this. President of Harvard, academic, Treasury Secretary. He helped Obama through the whole crisis, all the Obama fiscal policy, business experience, Wall Street, worked on Wall Street, hedge funds, private equity, and the guy had the genes. What do I mean? His mother, Anita, and father, Robert, they were my professors at Penn in the economics department. Brilliant professors. Robert's gone, Anita, she still lives outside in Gladwin. She's up in ages. Her brother, Kenneth Arrow, Chicago, brilliant economist. The father's brother, Paul Samuelson, they changed their name. Paul, how many of you remember the Samuelson book in economics? That's the book we grew up on. Certainly in Gainesville, that's what we used. I'm sure everybody else used it. But this guy had the genes. But he had a problem. Remember I said you could be very smart and not be street smart? And you could be very smart and sometimes say dumb things. Well, he angered a lot of people. When he was at Harvard, he made some dumb comments. Anybody remember those comments he made? Like saying, for example, that there's an innate difference between men and women when it comes to things like mathematics and science. That alone killed his chances at the university, and of course angered a lot of people, including a professor at Harvard by the name of Liz Warren, who became now Consumer Financial Protection Bureau Senator Warren. And she single-handedly killed his nomination. Single-handedly. And of course, Janet, she very excellent. She's from Brooklyn, Hamilton High, academic, Harvard, Berkeley, LSE. Clinton brought her to Washington, important point to remember, CEA. She's been at the Fed. She's a Fed lifer, pretty much. She has, her husband got the Nobel, not her or her family, but she got the problem, no business or Wall Street experience, okay? This gets back to that issue of book smart, street smart. Now, the thing I like about Yellen is that she very much believes in the importance of everybody doing well, not just Wall Street. Because there's, this whole issue of Wall Street versus Main Street. She's definitely more Main Street. She cares about unemployment. So if you are going to look at one thing to determine when rates are going to be raised, you're going to have to look at unemployment and conditions in the labor market. So for example, you can see here, she's committed to increasing employment, reducing unemployment, very concerned about wages, the human costs. I mean, these are things Obama would never say about Bernanke or about Greenspan. And listen to her own comments. We have to serve all the American people. Too many Americans still can't pay bills. Wages are flat. Even though unemployment's down to 5.4%, we got what's called the U6, the long-term unemployment. We're not there yet. And so she wants to make it better. So this is a very good point about Janet. Obviously, some Fed members yesterday, Larry Lindsey. Remember Larry Lindsey at the Fed? He said yesterday, by not cutting rates, she would be laughed out of any school room. She'd be laughed out of college. He said that about her. So obviously a lot of the Fed former people are not happy about her. This is a little inside joke at the Fed. What is the favorite lunch at the Fed? Dove sandwich. She's considered the supreme dove. Even Bernanke was dovish. She is the supreme dove. And of course, we're interested now in really three things. We're not just interested when the rate will go up, because we know it'll go up, the Fed funds rate. Remember, this is the Fed funds rate. We know it's going to go up. But we also interested in how aggressive it'll be. Will she go up like this, slow, and quarter point, 25 basis points? Or will she go up like that, like Greenspan did? And then, what non-rate actions? Non-rate are like jawbone. Remember she made the comment in Europe the other day saying the stock market's too highly valued, market went down? Making comments like that, that's just, talking the talk, but not walking the walk. What does she think about rules, like the Taylor rules? Well, not very much. She specifically says simple rules like the Taylor rule help us in normal times, but we're in complex times. These rules are just too simple and ignore complexities. Key words: data-dependent, evolving judgments. These are all code words for discretionary action. Not rules, discretionary. So the answer to the question is, when is she going to raise rates? Well, she has to be reasonably confident of a 2% inflation. We're under that. Okay? So reasonably confident. Again, hedge words, must not impede solid growth, continued improvement. These are all subjective, feel nice words. They're not hard and fast rules like the Taylor rule. So I say she's not total discretion like Greenspan. She's not rules like Bernanke. I call it discretionary rules. She's making the rules and adding in discretion. And the big question is going to be, who could she help and who might she not help? Well, this is an old picture. You can see her in the background. Bill Clinton brought her to Washington, to the Council of Economic Advisors. you know, people don't forget when other people do you favors, okay? And the other person that did her a favor, big favor, Elizabeth Warren. So one of the big questions is, what happens next year? How do you repay somebody who brought you to Washington? How do you repay somebody who got you the job instead of Larry Summers? Again, I'm just throwing out these ideas. In fact, when I wrote this article for The Banker, the very last paragraph I put in there, they removed it. And I said to the editor, why are you removing it? He said, well, Ken, it doesn't look good. But you know what I said? I said, wouldn't it be something if the first African-American president appointed the first female Fed chair who helped get elected the first female president? Ken, no, you don't want to say that. This will make you look. I don't mind. No. The point was, we have to look at politics and economics. Okay? So that's why I think my bottom line is, we're not going to see an increase in June. That's, everybody knows that. September, it's not going to happen either. I don't even think we're going to see an increase until 2016. And more importantly, I think by the end of 2016, December, we may only be at 50 basis points. Not 1 or 1.5 like some Goldman and others are predicting, because she will always find a reason why we don't need to raise rates. Because unemployment, there's tons of reasons why, based upon her view, and that's very important. Now, let's go to the micro, because that's why we're here, right? ALLL. And we're going to talk about the same exact question, rules versus discretion. Now, you could have a very simple rule, or you can have a lot of discretion. Now, from what I've been seeing in the last few days, there's a lot of discretion, a lot of acronyms here, you know, the FAS, the CECL. I heard a new one yesterday. What was it? The FICL? That one I've not heard of. But, the point is, this is the rule book, you know, what the FDIC says. But we know the rule book is loaded with a lot of exceptions. Now, we saw these charts from our previous speaker this morning. This is the loan loss allowance relative to total loans. So ALLL over total loans. And you can see from 2010, this has come down quite a bit to where it is now about 1.75%. That's the total average for all 6,500 banks. Now, of course, one of the big reasons why it came down is the big banks, which we know dominate from our last presentation, they do what? They were piggybacking and using the ALLL as a cookie jar for making money for the last couple of years. Okay, that's what happened there. Now, we look at we saw this chart earlier too, charge-offs versus the ALLL. But what I want to focus on is, here's the non-current loans and net charge-offs. You see how they run together. You've seen all these during your presentation. I wanted to come up with a quick and dirty rule. Okay, a simple rule like the Taylor rule, where you can say, look, this bank's over-reserved, under-reserved. Something that's very simple. You know, the KISS rule, keep it simple, stupid. Well, you know, academic, you should be doing something fancy, some big models, all the stuff we saw here. I say, you know, that's good, but sometimes you need something just simple. Something take back to very simple. So I've been using the reserve coverage ratio, RCR, as my quick and dirty rule. ALLL over non-current. Okay, right away you say, oh wait now, non-current, not total loan, non-current. That's only what we have now. A non-current, say as of March 31. Well, guess what? Our present non-current really reflect, they are backward looking because they reflect where it was, and they are somewhat forward looking. If you want to predict, you start from the beginning. So your current non-current, your present non-current are a very important indicator. So I say, well, let's just look very simply at reserves and non-current. And then I said, obviously, it's quick and dirty. So how would you clean it up? Well, if you want to clean it up, you say, I don't like to use quick and dirty. So you can use all of the Q factors we've been talking about. Mitigating and aggravating factors. Basically, these are what? These are Campbell things. Capital, asset quality, TDR, REO, charge-offs, management experience. These are all pretty much Camel. But I want to focus on one in particular, the TDRs. I call these NOT. NOT ratio is all your bad stuff. So that would include your non-current, your ORE, and your TDR. NOT. That's my NOT. Look at this fact. 40% of the 568 banks, about 10% of American banks, just under 10%, report no NCLs. Okay? So 568 banks, we're perfect. We have no NCLs. Excuse me, let's look behind the cover, and what do we find? 40% of them have ORE or TDR. Now, I'm not saying TDR is banking's little, dirty little secret that we don't talk about. But there are some banks that make a very big part of their culture to hide a lot of their NCLs and TDRs when they really should. And that's why we have to look beyond it. We look at 30, 60, 90 days, but a lot of TDRs, they tell a lot about culture. So I create this ratio here, that not over the NCL. About 10% of the banks are doing all right, but look at this. 40% of all banks have more than two times the amount of TDR than they do NCL, non-current. Well, in your book, you're going to see a very detailed chart I prepared. And this is the biggest part, and thank you for reproducing all this because it was so big. But you're going to see I created a chart in here where I've got all 6,500 banks using December 31 because the FDIC has not come out with the March 31 QBP yet. And then I marked in different indicators where I believe the guidelines are. Now, when I published these in the American Banker, a lot of people criticized them. They said, well, who is he to say? And one person said, oh, these Compass rules, they don't make any sense. We can't just come up with one number. I mean, think about it. If you have one number to do loan, AAA adequacy, why are we even here? Right? Why do we need CECL? Why do we need all these models? You just calculate one number, we're done. Let's go fishing, We're done. We don't need all this stuff. Well, this is my definition. You're well reserved at 100% or higher. So if you've got 5 million in non-current, you have 5 million of ALLL, you're well reserved. If you're 75%, you're adequate. But below that, and I use the same terms that we use in our capital adequacy, you're either under-reserved, significantly, or critically under-reserved. So then, I took all 6,500 banks, and you'll see them in your notebook. You'll find your bank here. And you'll see that the dark red are the first ones 25% or under. Now there's 192 banks in dark red, critically undercapitalized. But my problem is, 20% of those banks would not show a profit if they had even decent, proper loan adequacy reserves. So how do you know that? Banks that are reporting 0.1, 0.2, 5, 6, 8, 10, 15 basis point ROA, that ROA would disappear quickly. Even those 25, 30, that would all disappear. So they're basically showing a profit when they should be at a loss. Okay, now this is a problem for if you're an SEC investor, I'm very concerned about that. If my company is showing a profit, and they really should be reporting a loss because they're under reserved. So that's one issue. Then you can go to the opposite issue. Remember our friend here, SunTrust, they get hit by SEC for having too many reserves, excess reserves. Well, there are some banks, if you go to the very back of the chart where they have the green reported, and these are in the green, you'll see there's some banks like Morgan Stanley Bank, 94 million of ALLL, 0 TDR, 0 ORE, 0 MCL. Okay, so you might say they're over reserved. And then I found a little bank in Osage City, Kansas. It's called Tightwad Bank. True. Tightwad Bank. Tightwad Bank has 15% of ALLL to their loans. 15%. They have no TDR, no non-current, no ORE. 15%. Okay. Again, you might say, like Foxworthy, you might be a redneck. Well, you might be over-reserved. There's another bank, Westchester Bank, 7.4 million ALLL, 410 million loans, no MCL, no ORE, no TDR. Okay, you might be over-reserved. And then the other ones, you might be under-reserved. But what's interesting about this book, this material, is you can look at some corporate culture of what some banks do with their TDR. So if you look at the big banks, like Wells Fargo, their reserve coverage ratio is 34%. They're very low. Bank of America, JP Morgan, they're at 58%. Citi's up at 121%. Citibank reports 10 billion of non-currents, but they got 10 billion of TDR. They got an equal amount. Now that's very different from Wells Fargo. They're reporting 32 billion of non-current, but only 11 billion of TDR. So you see, this is a matter of what corporate, remember Tom Curry talked about corporate culture? This is an indicator of corporate culture. SunTrust has a 112% ratio. They're reporting 1.7 billion of non-performers. However, 2.5 billion of TDR. They got more TDR than they do non-current. So right away that tells you what? That's an indicator of corporate culture. TDR is something we have to look at. Now, we go on from here. This reserve coverage ratio we know has been coming up. That's the red line. Of course, the green line, non-currents, we know is coming down. This is over the period of the crisis. And if you look at the actual pre-crisis, now June of 07, the crisis officially started on August 7, 07 at 2 p.m. That's when Ben Bernanke refused to cut rates, okay? So the end of the good times in banking, the good times are over in June of 07. That was the last FDIC period. 73% of banks well reserved, so in total about 80% of banks were adequate and well reserved. Only a small portion were under reserved, and the average RCR 120%. Now that's pre-crisis, June of 07. Now we get into the crisis, and you can see that 120% RCR almost cut in half to 64%. And the percent of adequate or well-reserved banks went from 80% down to 50%. And then that's during the crisis, and then we go post-crisis, we're back up. We're not up to 100, and this is the most recent number, 75%, the average. We're not up to the 120% of the good times, but we're getting back. And you can see we've got about 75% of banks still below where we were before, but we are not quite back to the good times. This final chart is kind of a comparison. Okay, you can't read that. That's pre-crisis, this is a crisis, and this is post-crisis, this is current. And you can see the banks that were significantly under reserved, now that's come down. Same with this category, and the banks that are well reserved will come up. Now, you say, well, this is all just one indicator. It's one ratio. How can you take something so complex, something so detailed that we have an entire conference on, and we've got all these consultants and all this money we're spending, when we can just use one ratio? Well, the fact is, we get back to the same issue before that we had with the monetary policy. Do we use rules or discretion? I like the Taylor rule. Now, Janet doesn't, but I like it. It gives a good indication. And I like the rule I do for RCR. Of course you can criticize it. You can know all the Q factors, but here's the point. I would recommend you look at where your RCR was, you track the trends of the several years, and then you create a peer group, a real peer group. Not just using the Uniform Bank Performance Report, but you look at the ones in your area, size, similar business strategy, and you look at what their RCR is. And then, like you do in an appraisal, you go up and down, you apply these different mitigating, aggravating factors, and say, well, we got much stronger. We have 20% capital. And by the way, I should have mentioned, I've been on a community bank board myself, so I face a lot of these issues 15 years. And you got 20% capital, you can make a lot of mistakes with your ALLL calculations, and nobody really cares. Let's face it. So you look at these other factors, but this is just one more tool in your toolkit. So when you go back and you have a CEO say, well, what do you think? What did you learn at the conference? Well, it's complicated, we got this, we got that, but you know what? According to this very simple rule, we're either all right or we're not, and we have to just keep an eye on it. It's just an additional tool I'm saying you have in your kit. Everything you learn here, of course you need it, and you're going to need it to go to your regulators. Your regulators are never going to accept that simple rule any more than Janet accepts the Taylor rule, because, well, they would lose their job. That's what Milton Friedman said. Abolish the Fed, use the constant growth rate rule. We don't even need the Federal Reserve. That's Milton Friedman, smartest economist ever in the last century, other than Lord Maynard Keynes. Okay? So he would get rid of the Fed in total. And obviously, if they had a simple rule like this, we wouldn't need the regulators. So they're never going to accept it. They're going to say, well, you don't have this. Of course they're right. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with KISS. Keeping something simple. You're going to your board, They're not gonna understand all the FASB and the CECL and all this stuff. You gotta keep it simple. So this is one way to keep it simple. There's nothing wrong with the KISS rule. In summary, thank you very much for having me. And again, please take a look at the numbers in here. They got a lot of good stuff. And if we have some time, we'll have some questions.
Yeah, got about 10 minutes.
Okay, well, any questions, feel free.
I have a question.
Please.